On a wet rock in a dark forest stream in the heart of Africa sits what looks like a perfectly ordinary frog. Brown, damp, unremarkable. You would walk straight past it without a second glance. But watch what happens the instant something tries to grab it. It does not simply hop away. It does not puff up or scream or play dead. Instead, it does something so extreme that no other animal on Earth is known to do it on purpose. It deliberately breaks the bones in its own feet and drives the jagged, broken ends straight out through its own skin to arm itself with a set of claws. It builds them on the spot in the moment of pure terror by snapping the tips of its own toe bones loose and pushing the sharp, broken ends out through the skin of its feet like blades punched through from the inside. Stay with me because this animal has earned two entirely different nightmarish nicknames. And its second secret, the reason it is also called the hairy frog, is somehow even stranger and gentler than the first. This is Trichobatrachus robustus. To the scientists who first described it, it is the hairy frog. To almost everyone who hears its story, it is the horror frog, or the Wolverine frog. It lives in the fast, cool streams of the Central African rainforest, in Cameroon, Nigeria, Gabon, the Congo, a big, heavy, surprisingly muscular frog that spends much of its life in and around running water. It was formally described well over a century ago, and yet for most of that time its single most famous feature made absolutely no sense to the scientists holding it in their hands. Let's start with the claws, because that is the part that sounds impossible. Look at a hairy frog's foot when the animal is calm, and you will see nothing unusual at all, just a normal frog's toes. The weapons are completely hidden. Inside the tip of each of those hind toes sits a tiny sharp spur of bone, and that spur is held in place, pointing harmlessly backward, anchored to a small bony nodule by a piece of tough connective tissue. It just rests there, disarmed and invisible, until the frog is seized. When a predator grabs it, and the frog decides it is fighting for its life, it contracts a muscle in its toe, hard, and that contraction hauls the sharp spur of bone downward with enough force to snap it clean off the little nodule that was holding it in place. The freed shard of bone, now loose and needle-pointed, is driven straight down, and it punches out through the skin of the frog's own toe, emerging into the world as a curved claw. Not a claw that grew, a claw made in a single instant out of the frog's own deliberately broken skeleton. Think about how strange that is compared to every other clawed animal you know. A cat's claws are keratin, the very same material as your fingernails, sheathed in soft tissue, slid in and out painlessly whenever the cat pleases. This is nothing like that. The hairy frog has no ready-made claw waiting at all. To arm itself, it has to fracture its own bones and force them out through its own living flesh, wounding itself on purpose every single time. It is one of the only animals on the entire planet known to intentionally break part of its own skeleton and injure its own body purely to make a weapon. It quite literally hurts itself in order to survive. And here is the eerie part that scientists still argue over. When the danger has finally passed, those bone claws appear to simply withdraw back inside. The shard slips back beneath the skin, and the wound in the toe heals over, leaving the frog looking once again like a perfectly ordinary frog sitting quietly on a rock. A small animal, carrying a set of retractable blades made of its own bones, ready to shatter its own feet all over again, the very next time something decides it looks like an easy meal. Sit with that image for a moment. A small brown frog, cornered in the dark, choosing to snap its own bones, and stand there bristling with claws made of its own broken skeleton, rather than be taken quietly. Now you might think an animal that stabs attackers with its own bones must be utterly alone in nature, some one-off freak of evolution. But it isn't, quite. Far to the north, in the streams and ponds of Spain and Portugal, there lives a creature called the Spanish ribbed newt that plays almost exactly the same terrible trick. When it is threatened, it swings its sharpened ribs forward and pushes them out through little pores along its own sides, turning its rib cage into a row of poison-coated spines that jut straight through its skin. Two very different animals, an ocean apart, both arriving at the same brutal idea, that when you are soft and slow and desperate, sometimes the deadliest weapon you have is your own skeleton, if you are willing to break your body to use it. Nature does not invent that lightly, and the fact that it invented it more than once tells you just how powerful an answer it is. For the hairy frog, this puzzle sat unexplained for a remarkably long time. Researchers could see the broken bones and the strange claws, but the sheer idea that a living animal would fracture its own toes as a defense was so far outside anything else in the animal kingdom that it took until fairly recently for a biologist to piece the mechanism together and realize what he was actually looking at. This frog wasn't damaged. It wasn't deformed. It was armed in the most self-destructive way imaginable, and it had been doing it unnoticed the entire time. But the claws are only half of why this animal is so strange, because that other name, the hairy frog, has to come from somewhere. And it does. During the breeding season, the male hairy frog grows what looks, for all the world, like a thick covering of hair, sprouting along his flanks and down the sides of his powerful thighs. A frog apparently growing fur. For years it looked bizarre and pointless and faintly comical. But those are not hairs at all. They are long, thin extensions of his own skin, and every single one of them is packed with tiny blood vessels. And once you understand why he grows them, the horror frog suddenly turns into something almost tender, because the male hairy frog is a devoted father. After the female lays her eggs down in the stream, it is the male who stays behind to guard them, pressed close to the clutch in the cool running water, for far longer than a frog can comfortably hold its breath. A frog breathes partly through its lungs, and partly straight through its skin, but guarding eggs underwater, hour after hour, his lungs alone are nowhere near enough. He needs more oxygen than his body can normally pull from the water, so he grows more body to pull it with. Those hair-like strands are surface area, thousands of tiny, blood-rich outgrowths of skin that let him absorb far more oxygen directly out of the stream, turning his own flanks into a set of temporary hair-like gills. The horror frog grows hair for one reason, and one reason only, so that he can stay underwater long enough to keep watch over his children. And that toughness runs right down to his young. The tadpoles of the hairy frog are not the soft little specks you might picture. They are large, powerfully muscular, and their mouths are ringed with multiple rows of hard, horn-like teeth. Unusual, formidable little animals built to hold their own in fast, tumbling water, and thought to be far more carnivorous than most. From the father breaking his own bones to the strange breathing hair, right down to the armored muscular babies, this is a family built top to bottom for a hard life in a hard place. If an animal that breaks its own bones to make claws and grows hair to breathe for its young is the kind of impossible creature you want more of, do me a quick favor and subscribe. There is a new wild survival story here every single week, because there is one more part of this frog's story, and it says as much about us as it does about the frog. To the people who share its forest, the hairy frog is not a marvel of biology. It is food. In parts of Cameroon, it is hunted and eaten, speared, or dug out and cooked, and hunters have long treated it with a certain wariness, using long spears and blades and being careful how they take hold of it, precisely because a frog that stabs back with its own broken bones is not something you want to close your bare hand around. And there is something worth sitting with in that. Here is a single animal that will fracture its own skeleton rather than be caught, and reshape its own body rather than let its eggs go unguarded. And to us, for most of its history, it has simply been a strange-looking thing to catch for the pot. It was quietly doing two of the most extreme things in all of nature, in the dark, in a fast forest stream, long before anyone ever thought to ask how or why. Because when you finally put its two secrets side by side, you realize they are really the same secret. Breaking its bones to make claws, and growing a second skin to breathe for its young. Both are the same animal, doing the same impossible thing, being willing to tear its own body apart, to survive and to make sure its children survive. One is violence turned inward, for defense. The other is sacrifice turned inward, for the next generation. Same frog. Same absolute refusal to give up. So think back to that plain brown frog on the rock, the one you would have walked straight past. It looks like nothing at all, but inside it is a creature that will shatter its own feet rather than be eaten, and grow itself a whole new way to breathe rather than let its children drown for want of air. The most ordinary-looking animal in the entire stream turns out to be, quietly, one of the most extreme survivors in the whole forest. So if this strange, brutal little story got under your skin, subscribe. There is a new wild survival story here every week. And be honest with me, down in the comments. Most of us flinch at a splinter or a paper cut. This frog breaks its own bones on purpose and would do it again the very next second, without a moment's hesitation, rather than be the one that gets eaten, and it will remake its own body from the inside just to keep its children breathing. So how much of yourself would you be willing to break, to survive, or to keep the ones you love alive? Because tonight, in a dark African stream, a small brown frog already knows exactly what its answer is, and it would give that answer again in a heartbeat, the very instant anything reaches for it.